Welcome in. Today we're diving into something pretty cool. A detailed atlas of how land is used in India.
An atlas. Okay, you have my attention.
Yeah, but this isn't like your average road atlas. This one's built on 17 years of satellite data,
Wow.
showing how India's landscape has transformed, from those sprawling cities to the farmlands and even those like remote corners that we never really think about.
17 years of data. That's incredible. You could practically watch a country evolve right in front of you.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're talking maps, charts, and some pretty surprising trends. Luckily, expert speaker is here to help us understand it all. They're like the pro at seeing the big picture when it comes to land use.
Happy to be here. This atlas sounds like a gold mine for anyone trying to understand India today.
Oh, it really is. And let me tell you, this wasn't just some casual weekend project. This atlas, this is serious science. It was put together by India's National Remote Sensing Center.
Wow.
And they use data from ResourceSat satellites. They even brought in some Landsat data when those pesky clouds would get in the way.
Talk about a collaborative effort. It's like they gathered all the best intel to get the clearest picture possible.
And they tracked so many different land categories. It's amazing. We'll hit the highlights today. So like how much land is built up, how much is used for growing crops. And speaking of crops, they even dove into the types of crops grown each season. In India, you've got your kharif crops, which thrive in the monsoon season. Then you got your rabi crops that prefer the winter, and even zaid crops planted in between.
Sounds incredibly detailed.
Oh, it gets even more granular. They even have categories for double cropping and even triple cropping, where farmers can get multiple harvests from the same plot of land in a year.
That's fascinating. It really speaks to the ingenuity of these farmers finding ways to maximize their output.
And speaking of maximizing, they didn't just map what's there now, they tracked the changes year by year over that 17-year period.
That's what makes this so valuable. With that long-term data, you can really start to identify trends and understand how land use is evolving.
And boy, are there some interesting trends. For example, we know India's population is booming, right?
Right, one of the fastest growing in the world.
So naturally, the atlas shows a significant increase in built-up areas, which makes sense. More people, more homes, more cities. But here's where it gets interesting. Some states have urbanized way faster than others, and that reflects a whole bunch of factors, like economic development, even government policies.
It's a window into how different regions are changing and adapting.
Absolutely. And speaking of adapting, check this out. The atlas shows a huge surge in double and triple cropping.
Wow.
It's like they're squeezing every ounce of potential out of the land, but that makes you wonder about the impact, right?
Exactly. I mean, more harvest from the same plot of land sounds great for productivity. But what about the long-term health of the soil? What about water usage? There are definitely some trade-offs to consider.
That's a really important point, and it's something the atlas really made me think about. More crops are great, but what is the environmental cost? And is it sustainable in the long run?
It's about finding that delicate balance.
Speaking of balance, there's another fascinating trend the atlas revealed. This time it's about fallow land.
Okay, for those who might not know,
Yeah.
fallow land is basically land that's left unplanted for a while to allow the soil to recover.
Right, like giving the land a much-needed break.
Exactly.
And what the atlas shows is a decline in fallow land over those 17 years. It seems like less and less land is getting that essential rest period.
That's a critical observation. Leaving land fallow is essential for soil health, preventing erosion, even conserving water.
Right?
But again, like most things, it's all about balance. The atlas provides this amazing bird's-eye view of how these practices are playing out across a vast and diverse country.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is, and this goes into another really interesting point. The atlas maps out this traditional farming method called shifting cultivation.
Essentially, it's where farmers cultivate a plot of land for a few years and then move on to another, allowing the first plot to regenerate naturally.
Right, like a rotation system, but like on a larger scale.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is that the atlas reveals a connection between the prevalence of shifting cultivation and the amount of woodland.
So the way farmers use the land in one area can actually impact forests miles away.
Precisely. And this is where that big picture perspective becomes so crucial. It's tempting to just view land use in isolated chunks. You know, this much for farming, this much for cities. But the reality is so much more fluid. Changes in one area can ripple out, impacting seemingly unrelated ecosystems.
And this atlas makes those ripples visible, which is huge. It's like we know things are connected, but to actually see those connections play out across an entire country over almost 2 decades.
Wow.
That's next level insight.
It really drives home the point that it's not just about managing individual plots of land. It's about understanding how those plots fit into the larger landscape mosaic.
It reminds me of that saying, can't see the forest for the trees. This atlas is like zooming out and finally seeing that whole forest.
Yes, and appreciating how the health of one tree, or in this case, one land use type, can really impact the health of the whole forest.
And this all links back to what we were saying earlier about the potential downsides of maximizing that agricultural output. So sure, more crops are great, but if it comes at the expense of soil health, water resources, and even those distant forests, then it's not a sustainable solution, is it?
Exactly. It's like squeezing that tube of toothpaste. You might get a little more out each time, but eventually.
You're left with an empty tube and a mess on your hands.
Precisely. This atlas highlights the need to shift our focus from those short-term gains to really thinking about long-term sustainability. How can we meet our current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one that this atlas really forces us to confront. And it's not just about India either, right? These challenges, land use, resource management, balancing these competing demands, these are global issues.
Absolutely. And having this kind of detailed long-term data is essential for us to make informed decisions about the future.
Speaking of data, there's another fascinating piece to this puzzle, and it has to do with something we haven't really touched on yet, the Rann of Kutch. Now, this might sound like something straight out of a fantasy novel, but it's actually a very real and a very unique part of India's landscape.
The Rann of Kutch is a vast salt marsh, incredibly harsh, unforgiving. During the monsoon season, it floods, and then for the rest of the year, it's this stark, almost otherworldly landscape.
It's like something you would see on a nature documentary. And the atlas actually tracked changes in the Rann over time.
Which is incredible. This is an environment that's incredibly sensitive to changes in climate and water flow. And the data from this atlas can help us understand how the Rann is being impacted and what we can do to protect it.
It just goes to show that even in the most remote and seemingly barren corners of the world, there are stories to be told and lessons to be learned. It's pretty amazing, right? This atlas, it's not just about the maps and data points. It's really about understanding just how interconnected our world really is.
Exactly. And that the decisions we make about land use, even seemingly small ones, can have these huge ripple effects that we might not even realize.
It's like that butterfly effect idea. A small change here can lead to some massive consequences on the other side of the world, and that brings us to the real crux of it all.
Right.
You've seen the maps, you've heard the trends. What does this all mean for you? Why should anyone listening care about an atlas of land use in India?
Because it highlights a challenge that affects us all. How to create a sustainable future on a planet with finite resources.
Right.
I mean, the issues we've discussed today, urbanization, intensive agriculture, climate change, those aren't unique to India.
Right.
They're global concerns.
Yeah, and they're only going to become more pressing as the global population continues to grow.
Exactly. This atlas is a powerful reminder that we're all connected, not just to each other, but to the land that sustains us.
It's a call to action, really, to be more mindful of our impact, to make more sustainable choices, to really support those policies that promote long-term well-being for both people and the planet.
Absolutely. We need to think beyond our own backyards, beyond our own immediate needs.
Right.
What kind of world are we leaving for future generations?
And that brings me to my final thought. This atlas only covers data up to 2023.
Right.
What will the next 17 years bring? What will these maps look like in 2040?
That's the question, isn't it? The future is unwritten, and it really hinges on the choices that we're making today.
Will we continue down the same path? Or will we find new ways to innovate, adapt, and create a more sustainable future? It's definitely something for all of us to ponder, that's for sure.
Food for thought, indeed, and hopefully this deep dive has provided at least some of the context and inspiration to really fuel those conversations.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of India's evolving landscape. And a huge thank you to expert speaker for lending your incredible insights as always.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.